Then let me introduce to you Mr. Frian Aarsnes. He is a principal consultant at Econ Poiri, I hope I pronounced it correctly, and is also chairman of Publish What You Pay in Norway. His presentation is called How the Corporate Market Works, Anonymity in the Global Market. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's very seldom I'm able to be the appetizer before lunch. Before I start, I would like to bring up a point which also relates to some of the slides I have. And that was a question that came up last here. How do we fix this? And I'm sort of both pessimistic and optimistic. I'm pessimistic in respect to history, because history has shown us that the only thing that fixes things like this is actually war. If you go back and look at history, these things have almost always been fixed by war. This may be a solemn thought, and hopefully society has come further and we are able to do something about things like this before we come to measures like that. That's why I took on being a chairman of Publish What You Pay Norway. Because I believe that the only thing that can stop something like this is that we do get transparency. And not only transparency about taxes, like what's going on in Dodd-Frank in the US and in the EU now, but transparency about the production, the revenues, the costs, and the taxes and investments. If we don't get that, many countries have huge problems, and I will show that these problems are not only for developing countries. We have a poem in Norway called Håvamål. It's to Norway some of the same thing as Beowulf for the UK. It's ancient, it comes from the 9th or 10th century. And it's a Scandinavian poem of how to try to trade wisely in foreign countries. And I'm going to steal very much from this poem, because this poem tells things that I cannot tell without being sued. I'll let you read them yourself. And the point goes to the red line. The strange threshold. I'm starting where Guttorm is stopping, the secrecy jurisdictions. This presentation is based on 3 premises. The extractive companies have been given the right to extract the resources from the countries they have activities in. The least the society can expect in return is that these same companies are transparent about their business. They have been given this right. In addition, most of these extractive companies are seeking financing, equity, and bonds in transparent markets. They are basing their business on transparent markets. And it should be a minimum requirement that such companies are transparent in return, in order to satisfy the information needs, not only of society, but also of capital and bond investors. And what works for extractive companies are usually also working for other multinational companies and transnational individuals. The unknown doors. Based on Guttorm's presentation, which I fully support, everything he said, you get, though, the impression that these are few people. And if you can only get around these people, we'll be able to fix it, although it may take a long time. But the problem is that if you go to multinational companies, all the activities within these companies, a lot of that is now going through secrecy jurisdictions. So more than 50% of every movement of capital in multinational companies are now going through secrecy jurisdictions. And this picture here shows why this is not only hampering resource countries anymore. These are the resource countries where essentially the resource companies are trying to take down the revenues by not selling the produce directly to market. Both goes to a secrecy jurisdiction before they go to the market, where you also see that they are trying to increase cost. But the same thing is also happening in the home countries, where they are trying to reduce revenues and increase cost. And this ends up trying to accumulate revenues and profits in secrecy jurisdictions. And you will find almost no cost here at all. What's the mechanisms here? Well, in taking out revenues from the resource-rich countries, based on what we see, the major elements are, of course, criminal practices and corrupt practices. Transfer pricing is known, but also massively now is coming derivatives. Derivatives was almost unknown of use back in 1970, has grown by the decade to 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, and is now a major item for losing revenue, untaxed revenue out of countries. I've been doing audits in places where we have seen only over less than 10 years companies going from having absolutely no derivatives and selling at market rates to going to situations where they are actually, through the use of financial instruments and derivatives, moving up to 20% of their gross revenue out of countries. Many companies don't even have 20% as a gross margin. This is 20% of their gross revenue. This means that there is absolutely no profit left to be taxed. there is nothing left. You can have a tax rate of 50%, and it's zero. 50% of zero is still zero. When it comes to what is happening to home countries, these are the mechanisms. Derivatives comes up again, transfer pricing comes up again, but also tax regulation abuse is a significant source out of the home countries, but also influencing the international accounting standard boards, influencing the OECD to slow down reform processes. And if you look at how you increase your cost in home countries and resource countries, again, tax regulation abuse, transfer pricing, derivatives, but now, during the last 10 years, has emerged the mark-to-market. The fact that you are taking market rates, so anywhere in the world where you have the highest rate, other assets are being priced at the same thing. And it's not the countries that are providing the market that gets the taxes, but it's actually the assets that sits in the secrecy jurisdictions. So by using derivatives, mark-to-market, and transfer pricing, there is very few companies in the world where I should not be able to pull out all the profits of all the subsidiaries in an entire global company and not leave a profit for taxation anywhere. I should be able to move the entire profit outside the global market. Although all my money was earned through selling my production in the same markets. And only to the extent that I were intelligent enough to understand that I would be prosecuted if I were trying to do that, would I leave enough for taxation in the countries so that those countries and those politicians will still want to have my company in the country. There is absolutely no reason why I should pay tax anywhere in the world. Absolutely none. Do you find this surprising? Do you find this worrisome? Do you find this challenging? Do you think I'm lying? Okay, let me take an example. I'm outside the coast of Africa or South America. I have been given the right to explore the resources there. I make a discovery. I go for the development of those resources using an FPSO. The country has not put its tax regulation in place, which is approximately 80% of the world's countries. I will go for the development with an FPSO, which will be owned out of a secrecy jurisdiction. because the country allows me to. I will charge market rates for that FPSO. The market rates are created by, amongst other markets, where there are little supply. Norway is one of them, but Norway is only one of them. There is many of these places. The rate will be so high and will change by the oil price to such an extent that there will only be a few dollars left of profit, because the market rate will follow the pressure in the markets. If the oil price is very high, there is high pressure for developing new fields in the world, which means high market rates, which means less profit. And to the extent I still have a profit after I've taken that market rate on that asset, I will enter into derivative contracts which moves between 10 and 20% of my gross revenue. I will time it. I will find all of the good arguments, which I know convinces tax administrations not to pursue me. And I will have moved the entire profit from that operation from taxation in that country. And I could have had the head of that tax administration sitting beside me when I ordered the FPSO, when I wrote the contracts, when I entered the derivative contracts, and when the consequences came. And there is nothing he could have done. This is why some of these instruments are so dangerous, because we are not necessarily talking about what is called in the world marketplace today illegal tax planning anymore. We are way, way, way into what is today called legal tax planning, which is because we have not taken a stand against what these secrecy jurisdictions can do to economies. Scary? I'm scared. I'm really scared. Because the economic consequences of this magnitude have in the past always led to war. And it's all about revenue. Pocketing as much as possible outside any tax jurisdiction. The antidote to secrecy is transparency. No less, no more. To the extent that society were able to create transparency through, for example, what Publish What You Pay is advocating for, country by country reporting, you can actually, for all the companies involved, freeze the time picture at the end of each year end, and that will stand forever. This is a more detailed picture of how governments are losing. And essentially, you may have heard the term war chests. The war chests of these companies are used to corrupt government people, to pay corporate people, but also to take over businesses that are not able to compete with them. Interesting? Yeah. This is how the market should work. Where you have the company in the red border, which picks up equity and debt from capital markets, repays capital, pays interest, pays dividends, which purchases goods from the supply industry, takes payments back to that supply industry, which extract natural resources and pays taxes to the country, and then sells goods at the commodity market and receives the revenue back in the form of prices for that commodity. That is the fundamental business model of an extractive company. That is how most people think that the market is working. This is conceptually how most people in the world think that the extractive industries are working. By seeing that slide, do you think that this is how it's working? No. How does it work? Companies in secrecy jurisdictions, you allow these to take out the natural resources at prices less than world prices. You make the countries pay more for the costs, and then you reinvest your money out of that secrecy jurisdiction and into country number 2 and number 3 and number 4 and number 60. And that's how Publish What You Pay, the report Piping Profits, find companies in the world with thousands of companies in secrecy jurisdictions. So who is harmed? Well, the problem cash flow is shown in fully red. When you reinvest out of a secrecy jurisdiction, more and more of your money will start circulating within the secrecy jurisdiction and the resource countries. So everything is reinvested out of there. That means that gradually more and more money is going in that direction, and less is invested out of the home country. If somebody with enough knowledge and just too little ethical sense, and the right contacts, wants to do something, what do? You see a company with a huge war chest, lots of money. That money cannot go up to the capital market in the form of dividends, because that releases taxes. And those companies don't want to pay taxes on those money. So what do? They borrow money in the capital market to pay the dividend, not taking the cash up. What happens when that money is big enough? Somebody without the right intentions starts buying the shares, are starting to use that company's dividends to take over that company. And in the worst case, we have a multinational company that will implode on itself when so much money in the company is coming out of the secrecy jurisdiction that the subsidiary in the secrecy jurisdiction can actually buy the mother company. How do we do that? How do you do it? You put out negative news, lousy dividends, bad reports, bad image to depress the stock price so that you can buy the shares cheaply, and then you utilize the war chest. If you're the right person. Scary? Yeah. Ancient wisdom. The point is that the Western world is now starting to feel the leakage. Massively. Not small leakages anymore, but massive leakages. What is a massive leakage in the Western world? It's not a brook. It's not a little river. It's the Amazon pouring into the Atlantic. These are a few countries that I've taken out of World Bank statistics. I cannot guarantee for the correctness of every one of these numbers, but I hope I can trust the World Bank. Greece, GDP, constant $2,000, 1960, 58 billion. We do not have the tax revenue. Population 8.7 million. Sorry, 1970. 1980, GDP in constant dollars have grown to $92 billion, $2,000. 9.6 million people. 1990, GDP 98 billion, population 10 million. 1995, GDP $105 billion. 10.6 million people. 18.9% tax revenue as percentage of GDP. First time we have statistics. 2000. GDP $124 billion. Population 10.9 million. 23.5% tax revenue as percent of GDP. Goes in the right direction, don't it? 2001, the year after, GDP 129 million. $10.9 million. Oops, tax percent goes down, 22%. 2005, 151 billion US dollars GDP. Population 11.1 million. Oops, tax revenue as a percentage of GDP has gone down to 20%. This is at the point in time when the world economy was at its greatest. And if you have noticed, governments are pretty slow with raising the thresholds for whereby income is not taxed. So when incomes goes up, the tax percentage usually either stays the same or increases. When something goes very good in the world economy, profit margins are increasing. Increasing profit margins are usually leading to higher taxes. 20%. And then 2010. GDP of Greece approximately on par with 2005, the peak year, among the peak years in world economy. GDP 153 billion US dollars. Population have not grown that fast, 11.3 million. Tax revenue 19.6. Look at some of the other countries. Don't look at 2010. Spain, 15.9% tax revenue of GDP in 1995, up to 16.2 in 2000. Good, it's increasing. However, 2001, back down to 15.8. 2005, 12.9. The peak of the economy. Global economy. United Kingdom has fared better. 26.3, 28.4, 28.2, 27.2, 26.7. But then UK doesn't have those same problems either. Big surprise. The US, we don't have statistics before 2001. 12.5% tax revenue as percentage of GDP. Do you believe it? This is the World Bank. Should we believe them? I hope so. 2005 US, 11.2% tax as percent of GDP. 2010, 9.4% tax as percent of GDP. 9.4%. Can you imagine how the US economy would have been in 2010 if they had the same tax percentage as in 2001? Only up from 9.4% to 12.5%. The US would not have been in problems. You can take the number yourself and calculate it out. You would not have problems in the US. Why is this happening? Because of greed and opportunity. And as Guttorm said, opportunity makes thief. What's the opportunity in the US? Well, you increase the cost so that the profit margin becomes less, so that even if they have 35% or 36% tax, it's 35 or 36% tax on a much less profit. You don't even need to go to the resource industry. The latest news is that the US is pretty angry at, for example, the medical industry, where companies like Pfizer, who has the biggest market in the US, almost pays no taxes to the US. And most of their profits is in secrecy jurisdictions. And the question is, how far can these leakages go before we fix them? And we get into real problems, except, or rather than the symptoms that we are now showing. We have the instruments that can fix it, or at least partially. Isn't it nice to have an ancient poem that you can draw on? If somebody can pay you for getting better terms, you absolutely know that they have much more money left. Okay? So is it the corrupt that gets most of the money? Or is it the companies? But the question also begs itself, what's wrong with the Ministry of Finance around the world? They have the ability to start fixing it. What's wrong? It's time to start asking the question. Is the work of the IASB in favor of the companies or in favor of the investors? It should be in favor of the investors, but currently it's for the companies. We have the measures. It can be utilized. It's only we need somebody to start utilizing it. The halfways are everywhere. I like that phrase. I love it. It's so telling. What's going on with media? They are asking questions and then they accept the answers. Lunch.